Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next session in the Authenticate Government Summit. This is a policy deep dive on how new policies and directives are changing how governments authenticate across the globe. My name is Jeremy Grant. I'm Managing Director of Technology Business Strategy at Venable. We're a law firm based out of DC, though I'm not a lawyer. There's a longer story there for another time. I also serve as an advisor to the FIDO Alliance. I've been helping them for several years now with engaging with governments across the world, in part to educate them about some of the great new innovations that FIDO and its members have been bringing both to the technology world and also the standards world, and ways that governments can take advantage of them and support them. And so we're going to be spending some time today talking about some changes, particularly ones we've seen over the last year that are really starting to change what is happening in the public sector space across the globe. And I think at a high level, to set the stage, and I think, folks who are attending this event know this, but what governments have to say about authentication can often have a very significant impact on what types of authentication are used within government. We see this in a bunch of areas in terms of how governments are actually deploying their own systems, how their deployments may feed into standards or complement standards work that their governments are doing. And also on the regulatory side, where in many cases, you've got government outlining how different parts of the commercial sector should be driving authentication. Government's a really important influencer and driver of change in many of these cases. And looking more specifically at why governments care about this, I think there's really four reasons why authentication is important to governments. One, internally, it's important for governments to actually protect access to their own assets. But you also need authentication if you want to empower or enable more high-value citizen-facing services to the public. It's important to empower the private sector to provide a wider range of high-value services to consumers in banking and payments, health and e-commerce, and protect against cybercrime and fraud. And we're seeing an increasingly focus on authentication that's being used to secure critical assets and infrastructure. I think across the board, regardless of whatever the use case is, you're seeing governments that are seeking identity authentication solutions that can deliver not just better security, but also better privacy, better interoperability because it's based in standards, and better customer experiences. And FIDO, one reason that FIDO Alliance has been proactively engaged on this front the last few years is that FIDO isn't like other authentication. And the FIDO specifications and standards that have been emerging from FIDO Alliance are offering governments some newer and better options for strong authentication. But in many cases, we found that governments have had to update some of their policies to support and recognize the ways in which FIDO is different. As technology evolves, policy needs to evolve with it. And we've really seen a huge evolution over the last 6 years. I think some of you know I used to be part of the Trusted Identities group at NIST and ran the NSTIC program. And in 2015, when I left government, FIDO was just starting to emerge. I think it's safe to say most governments across the globe had not heard of FIDO. Certainly, I knew what it was when I was at NIST. Most of the rest of the US government didn't. And where we saw regulations or guidance on what governments or regulated industries should be doing for multi-factor authentication, it largely pointed either to one-time passcodes or to PKI. And I think what we're seeing in 2021 is a really different environment across the globe, where FIDO authentication is emerging not just as another permitted option, but in many cases as a preferred choice of governments across the world. I want to start, some of this overview in terms of what we've been seeing over the last year in the US, where in September of 2020, guidance was put out by CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that's part of the US Department of Homeland Security. They put out guidance to different election organizations, both campaigns and other groups that were participating in the upcoming campaign, that did something I had not seen any government guidance do specifically before, which was calling out FIDO2 security keys as the single best type of MFA the campaign should use. And it also called out something that I think a lot of us have known for a while, which is that some of the older legacy forms of MFA, things that are based on time-based one-time passcodes, based on SMS text and email, as being phishable. And you can see here in italics, some of the points that they made around the specific benefits of security keys, and how they offer protection against phishing by working as a second factor of authentication that's physical and not just something that's based on a knowledge-based item, and only authenticating when a user's on the correct website. And they flagged, even if a user's tricked into supplying their password to a phishing website, the physical security key is still going to block the attackers. And this has really been part of a broader trend of much wider US government recognition of FIDO we've seen over the last year, including July of 2020, when NIST complemented its digital identity guidelines, special publication 800-63-3, with new implementation resources that gave really some additional color on things. And they highlighted FIDO both in terms of how single-factor cryptographic devices like security keys could be used to support 863, as well as multi-factor cryptographic devices, such as ones that are embedded in our endpoints, like our laptops and smartphones and tablets. It also noted that FIDO authentication can be used to deliver verifier impersonation resistant authentication, meaning it really isn't susceptible to phishing or other sort of more sophisticated attacks, and that OTP can't. We also last fall saw the NSA put out authentication guidance to their broader community that referenced both FIDO security keys and FIDO biometric certification requirements. And where we're heading now in 2021 is some new actions from the US government, really focusing on some of those foundational things we saw last fall, with a renewed focus on how do we actually come up with MFA that can stop phishing attacks. So NIST back in March posted a number of questions for the broader community globally on GitHub around how they should update their digital identity guidelines, including pondering, how they can actually differentiate at AAL2, Authentication Assurance Level 2, between authentication that's phishing resistant and that which is not. And, I won't read the whole, item here in terms of what was posted, but, they said that they're at least contemplating mandating phishing resistance at AAL2, but, sort of noting it might not be practical given some of the other types of MFA that are still useful, but at least looking for some way to point out to the community, one of these types of authentication is not like the others. And I think we'll know more probably later this fall or early next year when NIST comes out with a draft of their updates to this guidance in terms of how they're going to approach this. More recently, we saw in May of this year a new executive order on improving cybersecurity that was issued, focused on a number of things around authentication, including mandating that every agency should adopt MFA over the next 180 days. And this was in part response to the SolarWinds attacks and other compromises that the government seen, where it was time to focus, on making sure we really have universal MFA. And what's notable here is MFA is not, it's the priority, as opposed to what we saw in the past when it was, well, you have to use the PIV smart card, it has to be PKI. By focusing more broadly on MFA was opening the door to starting to let government agencies augment what they were doing with PIV and PKI with other types of MFA, which I think was a pretty big opening that was there in part because of the emergence of things like FIDO that also have a lot of the same security benefits and might be easier to implement or use. And they also, in the executive order, the president directed the Office of Management and Budget within the White House, OMB, to develop a broader federal cloud security strategy that moves agencies closer to zero trust architecture. Well, that's where there's some really exciting news just this past month. So on September 7th, OMB put out their draft strategy on zero trust architecture. And, some notable highlights that are out there. First, for agency staff, contractors, and partners, and anywhere in the government enterprise, it's not just MFA that's required. They specifically called out phishing resistant MFA. And they said for public users, phishing resistant MFA must be an option, meaning if I'm building a citizen facing application, well, look, I'm not necessarily able to give them something like a security key, but they need to at least support phishing resistant MFA. And they specifically did something which I'd never seen a government document, certainly at this high level, do before, which is they specifically called out the web authentication standard. They said agency's highest priority here should be to rapidly implement a requirement for phishing resistant verifiers, whether it's a PIV card or an alternative method such as WebAuthn. This is, I think, the first time that we've actually seen not so much a technical document, but a policy document coming from the White House pointing to a specific standard in the FIDO family. And just to dig through a little bit more of what's in the zero trust strategy. For enterprise applications, one thing they're focusing on is making sure that MFA is not being integrated so much at the network layer anymore. The old days of, I'll just authenticate once with MFA if I'm dialing in for VPN. But they really want it to be integrated at the application layer, tightly with enterprise SSO services. And in fact, there's some direction in the strategy as well to reduce some of the legacy ones. It also points out that, specifically they dove into why you need phishing resistant MFA like WebAuthn, saying that users can be fooled into providing a one-time code or responding to a security prompt, say through a push notification that grants the attacker access. And again, in the strategy, they specifically talked about the web authentication standard and the fact that it's supported today basically by every major consumer device and most major cloud services. Looking to the public-facing sector set of applications that are out there, here again, they pointed out how important authentication is, and to point out that anything that's a citizen-facing, the public-facing system needs to create more options for authentication. Again, here they pointed out how important it is that this authentication be phishing resistant. Highlighted that one option will be to actually provide support for WebAuthn-based approaches such as security keys. This is a draft. I'm hoping they point to things like platform authenticators as well in the final draft, since I think there's other ways that we can get there as well. And they pointed out, of course, that one challenge with the public is that not everybody's going to be able to get phishing resistant authentication right away. Some people might only have access to a landline. They might not own a cell phone or a smartphone. And so this was interesting to see how this new guidance is going out as well. So this focus on the US that I've been talking about, this really, talks about, I think, a broader trend across the globe, which has been the growing government recognition of FIDO authentication and its, role in the marketplace as, I think I said before, not just as a permitted option, but as a preferred option. So in the UK, I think a lot of folks are familiar with their Good Practice Guide 44, which is their version of digital identity guidelines around authentication to protect online services. The UK defines high quality authenticators as saying, ones that have been independently tested to prove it meets industry standards. And they pointed to, known certifications that are out there, including Common Criteria, the FIPS 140 program from NIST, and FIDO certification. And GPG 44 and some of these requirements have now been proposed for inclusion in a newer effort in the UK to create a broad digital identity and attributes trust framework, not just for government use, but also for private sector use across the United Kingdom. In Europe, ANISA earlier this year published a pretty comprehensive report on remote identity proofing that highlighted the role of FIDO, noting that the way FIDO2 can be used in different EID solutions in Europe, and actually made reference to a white paper that FIDO Alliance had published about a year earlier on using FIDO with EIDAS services as something that should also be a reference document in terms of looking at how you could leverage FIDO standards within EID solutions. And then moving to Australia, for a few years now, the Australian Signals Directorate has been putting out some really great guidance on not just authentication, but on cybersecurity in general and what they call their Essential 8 maturity model, focusing on 8 really critical controls that they urge everybody, government and the private sector, to embrace. And on their guide on implementing MFA, that's one of these 8 controls, they were actually the very first government, as far as I know, to recognize FIDO certified authenticators and the value that that program brings. So, I was talking about security keys. They specifically said, if you're using them, make sure they've been certified to the latest U2F specification version. This is a little bit of an older version now that FIDO2 is starting to supplant U2F. But their guidance specifically linked to FIDO Alliance's certification page, which is constantly updated with new authentication products that are being approved. And I mentioned, they're also in the Essential 8 security model. We've also started to see, recognition from Australia around the biometric certification program that the FIDO Alliance launched a couple of years ago. That's looking at, I think it's really the first globally focused independent, certification program looking at testing the performance of different commercial biometric components, say on-device fingerprint sensors or cameras used for face. And here, the DTA, the Digital Transformation Agency in Australia, as they put out their trusted identity guidelines for their digital identity framework, specifically points to some of the FIDO biometric requirements and how you prevent against presentation attacks and things like that as part of all this. So, really good to see the biometric element of what FIDO has been doing on the certification front recognized as well. And then globally, we saw something happen, I guess about a year and a half ago now, where the Financial Action Task Force published new digital identity guidelines for global financial services regulators. And, the FATF is, as they're known, as a group that is incredibly powerful and influential, but not necessarily well known. I think a lot of folks in the cryptocurrency space have learned a lot about the FATF the last few years as they've weighed in there. The FATF is think of them as a global standards making body that is made up entirely of financial regulators across the globe, specifically those regulators that are charged with making sure that different countries' financial systems aren't easily able to be exploited by people who are laundering money or financing terrorism or using these systems for other nefarious purposes. So the digital identity guidelines was really quite impactful in that it was essentially a set of standards that all of the regulators have to find ways to align with. And so the impact is most countries now have to align their financial services regulations around identity with this guidance. And one of the things that was really interesting to see was that FIDO authentication was referenced throughout the document and called out as a preferred approach. And, in a similar theme to what we've seen from other countries, the importance of phishing resistant MFA was highlighted in this. So if you go through the document, and I mean, it's pretty chunky. In fact, I've got my copy here. You can see how thick it is. Easily, 105 pages. But FIDO's referenced throughout the document. So page 21 gives an example of how FIDO can be used to create a credential after identity proofing. On page 43, they specifically point out some of the same vulnerabilities to legacy types of MFA like SMS and OTP, and talked about the need for phishing resistant authentication. You can see the language here calling out how things like FIDO and PKI can help combat these types of vulnerabilities. And they, gave FIDO as a specific example of how a consumer might log into a bank account using MFA in accordance with the FATF standards, noting that as part of an authentication flow, an individual might use a ownership or possession-based authentication factor, such as a private key that's generated in a FIDO certified authenticator embedded in their mobile phone. So really good as other countries are starting to focus on fintech and how to do digital identity and enable just more digital financial services in general. This guidance that's out there that specifically is pointing to FIDO as a preferred solution. So I think we have a little bit of time left. If there's questions on how government might view FIDO in your country, and my contact information is here, be it email or Twitter, if you'd like to take the conversation offline. So thank you.